Hello, how's everyone doing? Have folks seen that movie before? How many, raise hands? How many people have seen 13? Okay, cool. How many people have read The New Jim Crow? Okay, thank you. So I'm really happy to be here, first of all. I'm just really thrilled that we're having these conversations, right? As Glenn can attest to, I think less than 4 years ago, if we walked into certain spaces and started having conversations, speaking of mass incarceration, people would look at us like we're probably crazy, right? So I think almost, Ernie kind of started to make mention of it, and Glenn spoke to it towards the end, and my other panelists spoke to it, right? And I think we're kind of like still not really speaking to the issue here. Before we can begin to solve any problem, right, we have to begin to understand what the issue is. So we're here to begin a conversation around like criminal justice reform, right? That's why we're here tonight. First of all, if I were to ask folks, who's a criminal or what is justice, I believe, we would probably be hard-pressed to find consensus, right? And almost like along with that, right, there's an idea of a social contract which underlines this idea of justice, this idea of criminality. And as Ernie begun to make mention to, right, we've never had a social contract for people of color within the United States. People of color have never been legal in the United States. There's never been justice for people of color in the United States. As we talk about reform, so much of our ability to actually create change depends on our understanding of what these issues really are. And for folks that have seen 13, for folks that have read Michelle Alexander's work, for folks that have just seen this film and many other films, there's something that we have to ask ourselves. What is spurring this criminality in America? Why have we been conditioned to see criminality as black, as of color? And we're not having that conversation. This is essentially the conversation we were supposed to have in 1865, which we never had. But something, as Ernie brought up, what happened in 1865 was we transitioned one system to another system, and we did it right in front of everyone. Right, so the 13th Amendment, as Ernie said, it allowed slavery to continue. And that may sound really challenging for some folks, because I don't know who folks are in this room, but for a lot of people, I assume that sounds very challenging, right? The idea that neo-slavery, we're living in an era of neo-slavery. The 13th Amendment, by its very language, made that very clear, that you can continue to be a slave if you were convicted of a crime. Immediately post the 13th Amendment, you had black codes. What were black codes? You had laws that essentially criminalized every facet of black life. You had laws that criminalized poverty. You had laws that criminalized parents who were unable to take care of their children. You had laws that criminalized people for stealing food to survive. You had laws that criminalized looking white folks in the eye. These were black codes. Essentially, right after this system, then we had convict leasing system, AKA slavery by another name. So once convicted, these same folks were now able to be leased out to the same plantations in which they were abused generation after generation, also to railroads, also to any other business, as Ernie mentioned, because this is a business, right? Any other business looking for cheap labor. There was a narrative that was intentionally cultivated within social science that criminalized blackness. It was the same narrative that was cultivated around black inferiority to allow us to turn a blind eye to slavery. Fast forward 100 years, you essentially have the same game, right? You have a new facet of neo-slavery. You have the war on drugs, which is essentially a war on colored people. You have this fear of rising crime when the crime rates tell us opposite. I mean, it's very clear what this system is, and we continue to talk about reform. How can we reform slavery? It's very important that we understand that human beings are being destroyed within this system. And I think in many ways, the dehumanization of blackness in America, and it has happened, right? We have dehumanized blackness, we've dehumanized color. There's no other, and I mean, this is subjective, right? But I don't feel like there's any other people that have been dehumanized in the history of the world as black people, right? And this is why we understand that these systems continue to happen, because we're unable to see the humanity. Glenn spoke to that. So if we're going to have, and I'm conscious of the time, so if we're going to have reform, right, I think Angela Davis says something really imminent to this conversation. She says, we must seek to liberate minds as well as liberate society. We must seek to liberate minds as well as liberate society. Oftentimes when people show up in these discourses, they're only here to have their beliefs reaffirmed. Are you willing, as Glenn asked you, are you willing to be challenged in your foundation? And that is integral to this question. If we're going to have criminal justice reform, and I use those words very loosely, it has to be done in a historical framework. We can't talk about justice if we don't talk about the history of injustice within this country, historically, from the beginning to now. This is really similar. We're having an immigration conversation without talking about colonialism, without talking about imperialism, without speaking about globalism. That's very ironic. We need to destroy the myth of black criminality. This, again, is a myth that was intentionally cultivated. We need to destroy that myth. We have to understand that our humanity, our shared humanity, is bound in this. Our proximity to the fire is only our privilege. But we're all being impacted by a system that makes you believe that you're superior to me because of my skin color, because of my gender, because of the color of my eyes. Our humanity is at stake. We have to be trauma-informed. What I mean by this is that we're all being impacted within these systems. The way we conceived of trauma historically are from people coming home from war, right? PTSD, shell shock syndrome. Listen to the thing, right? People coming home from war. The stories that you heard tonight were what? People living in war, not coming home. It never ends. So there's no post anything. People living in war. So our approach always has to be trauma-informed. We have to understand what trauma is. We have to understand how it impacts people. We have to create systems that allow us to be sensitive to people and how they've been impacted by hundreds of years of oppression within this system. And finally, as Glenn always says, people closest to the problem need to be closest to the solution. This is imperative. This is really imperative, right? If you've had an experience, your ability to understand what that experience is going to be greater than anyone else. So this isn't something I do as academic discourse. This is not just, something I do as a job. At 18 years old, I was incarcerated. And as many people, I believe that the justice system was just. I believe that the justice system would have seen me in my totality and would have been willing to ask questions. That didn't happen. Instead, as a first-time offender, I was offered 40 years to life under the Rockefeller drug laws in New York City. When the judge, and most of us plea because we're unable to afford bail, right? After 7 months in Rikers Island and seeing the carnage, 1994, this was the height of the carnage on Rikers Island. This was the height of mass incarceration. And let me interject really quickly too, right? And you don't believe me when I tell you that people of color are criminalized and demonized? If you think this is a new conversation, it's not. If you listen to 90s hip hop, the era that I came of age on, it was all talking about mass incarceration. It was all talking about trauma. It was all talking about the destruction of their neighborhoods. 40 of us in the back of a bus. Life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough. But as the world turned, I learned life was hell, living in a world no different from a cell, right? This is Wu-Tang Clan. But we didn't listen because we haven't been able to see the humanity of people of color. So it's so integral. If we're to have change, we have to begin by asking ourselves, how are we complicit in this? How is our humanity being challenged in this? And it's till we're able to see the shared humanity that we'll have change. Thank you.